Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I really appreciate being here. It's a huge privilege. And it's a special privilege to be with such wonderful people who are on the faculty today. These are real wonderful people who are taking on the world. And I was thinking, I go back to, I was born in 1949, end of the Second World War. I think of Montgomery at El Alamein, which was the battle that decided the Second World War, or the direction of the Second World War. And Churchill chose Montgomery, and he sent him to El Alamein, and Montgomery sat there and he said, I will wait here until I've got the troops and the resources that I need to win this war, the Battle of North Africa. And that's what we're doing. We're just collecting the information, we're collecting the people, and one day we were going to destroy the rest of the world. But my point is, I would not go to war with anyone but the guys who are talking today. They are the leaders, they are the generals, they are the field marshals who are going to direct the world's revolution. And it's a huge privilege to be with them. And I just play a very small part. So this is a talk that I give quite frequently, but to give you some background, you'd want to know, where do I come from? I come from, my parents are from Liverpool. And why are they from Liverpool? Because Liverpool has a direct connection to New York, and that was the old sea trade. And my father happened to be an importer of this dreadful product from America, and he turned it into those things, which we've heard about earlier today. And at the end of the Second World War, he decided that he would rather go and do something else and be right at the source. So we went to Zimbabwe, to Salisbury in 1946, and I was born there in 1949, and we then went to Cape Town thereafter. But the point of the story is, when we arrived in Salisbury, we lived next to this man who wrote this paper in 1936. And it's titled A New Fossil Primate from Sterkfontein, and it's written by this guy, Trevor Jones. Now, Trevor Jones lived on the farm next to the Sterkfontein caves, and he went to the great paleontologist Raymond Dart and said, Raymond, or Dr. Dart, you will find primitive man right here in the Sterkfontein caves on our farm. And there he is, and there is Raymond Dart, who'd originally found the first pro-hominid, early hominid, in South Africa in 1923, and that was called the Taung skull. And Dart said that this animal is a pre-human because the foramen magnum, which is the gap between the junction between the spinal cord and the brain, is horizontal. So he said this animal walked upright. And the entire world said absolute rubbish. And for 20 years he went into deep depression. And eventually they said that was one of the major discoveries of the 20th century. So being ahead of your time, that's what happens. You get challenged. And he wrote that book. And because I was very privileged and have friends, this was the most famous skull that he discovered, Mrs. Ples at Sterkfontein, and she's 2 million years old. And this is her skeleton, and that's my watch. And you can see it's a very small skeleton. She's got a small pelvis. And that's the size that we were. That's the size we were 3 million years ago. And people, don't understand that, and that's what we look like today. And that's evolution. It's just astonishing. And so what Raymond Dart said, how did this happen? And he said, in the luxuriant forests of the tropical belt, nature was supplying with profligate and lavish hand an easy and sluggish solution by adaptive specialization of the problems of existence in creatures well adapted as those living arthropods, i.e. the chimpanzees and the other animals. For the production of man, a different apprenticeship was needed to sharpen the wits and quicken the higher manifestation of intellect. A more open felt country where competition was keener between swiftness and stealth, and where adroitness of thinking and movement played a preponderating role in the preservation of the species. So if you went to Johannesburg in South Africa 3 million years ago, that's what you would have seen. And the problem is these guys here, because they are the predators, and they were eating us. And we had to get bigger, or we just got eaten by those guys. But their problem is they're only active in the cool of the night. During the day, they are completely inactive because they can't thermoregulate. And so the reality was the only time we could survive was to hunt in the middle of the day in the heat. And that's how we evolved. So we went from there, who was an occasional omnivore, to this animal who is an omnicarnivore. And the reason we got from that to that was simply because we became long-distance runners. So this change occurred as humans became the best midday persistent hunters in the animal kingdom. And that allowed us to get the meat and the fat and the protein that we needed, particularly to develop this huge brain, because the brain here was 500 ml, and this is a brain of 1500 ml. So if I'd been giving this lecture 3 million years ago, we wouldn't have been having it in Australia, we would have been having it in South Africa, because these are the only guys who were living at that time, Australopithecus africanus. And so they lived in the trees, and with climate change, the veldt, or the savanna, opened up. And then these guys had a huge problem because there were no more trees to live off, and so they had to find food, and that was the food. There was the food. It was animal sources. And in order to be able to do that, we had to develop this huge capacity to sweat, and that's what we became. So successful persistent hunting requires intelligence, high sweat rates, and so on. And that was the key to the change. And with that change, our brain got bigger. And so we started at a brain this size, and it accelerated. And I don't have time to tell you, but this most recent acceleration in the last 200,000 years is really fascinating, because there's other work in South Africa suggesting that 200,000 years ago, there were 200 breeding pairs of humans alive on the whole planet. The entire planet, we were down to 200 breeding pairs. And they all lived in a place called Mossel Bay in southern Africa. And the rest, we'd been wiped out. But that's another story. And the theory is that those people who are working there think that it was the fish, adding fish to the diet, particularly the omega-3s, that suddenly caused this rapid increase in brain size in the last 200,000 years. But it's unproven, but you'll see. So anyway, because I expressed my genetics, I also ran and did lots of running. This is a picture 30-odd years ago, 32 years ago. And I ran a particular ultramarathon in Cape Town called the Two Oceans Ultramarathon. It's a 35-mile race. I was the 15th guy to run it 10 times, so I got that number. During that time, I was writing books and educating people and telling them this is the food you must eat. You must eat lots of these carbohydrates because they are very, very healthy. And I wrote this book, and there it says, in 2002, all athletes must be advised to eat high carbohydrate diets, as high carbohydrate diets are now considered ideal for both health and sport. So I apologize, I was absolutely, completely, utterly wrong. And I continued to run. This was running with a marathon with my daughter some years ago. And all this time, I thought I was incredibly healthy and going to live forever. And guess what happened? I developed type 2 diabetes. So I don't look like this guy, but I have these abnormalities. And the reason I got type 2 diabetes, very strong family history. My father died of the disease, and I'd eaten this high carbohydrate diet. There is no other explanation. Anyone that tells you that it was a high fat diet that caused my diabetes, nonsense, because I didn't eat fat. And if I could get through a day without eating fat, I would say, gee, that was a fabulous day. And all the time I was getting fatter, lazier, and more unhealthy. So 9 months ago, we put together this book, and it took us 6 weeks to write the book. Now, all the other books I've written have taken 10 years, and they haven't sold much. And this thing we wrote in 6 weeks, and it's a great tribute to my co-authors, John O. Proudfoot, Sally Ann Creed, and David Greer. And there are the chefs, and Sally Ann Creed is the nutritionist. And on Monday night, I'm glad to announce that we won the 214 Nielsen South African Booksellers Book of the Year. And it's been a remarkable journey since then. And it's been really exciting, but that's not the point of the talk. So where did we go all wrong? Well, the first thing is we have fear of food, and that we've always had fears of food. But what happened in the 1977, as Grant indicated, we developed lipophobia. And lipophobia is the single most important commercial driver of modern nutrition advice. And it is driven by the vegetable industry and the vegetable lobby in the United States of America. If you fear fat, if you fear saturated fat, it's because the actions of the vegetable food lobby in the United States government. They wanted to make sure that you took saturated fat out of the diet, replace it with vegetable oils. And we know that vegetable oils are dreadful for your health. You just have to follow the money. That's all you have to do to understand it. One of my great icons is George Sheehan, who wrote these fabulous books. And if you ever want to know about the philosophy of running, you have to read him. But what he said once All religions are correct in what they profess and wrong in what they deny. And so if you want to understand where errors lie, you must look at what is denied. And what I'm going to do today is show you what the current nutritional guidelines deny. Not so much what they profess, but what they deny. So, these are consensus guidelines, and you must never trust consensus guidelines because they are anti-science. Science is not about consensus. It's about disproof and disbelief and skepticism. It's not about consensus. When you have consensus, you've got trouble. So what's the consensus? That carbohydrates are essential to our health, essentially, and you must eat 65% of your daily energy. What they deny is that humans have no essential requirement for carbohydrate. And that's not something I knew until 4 years ago. There's no known carbohydrate deficiency disease. So how can you base a balanced diet on an energy nutrient for which humans have no essential requirement? It's absolutely astonishing that we let them do it. Valdemar Stefansson was one of the first guys to start questioning, do you need to eat carbohydrates? He lived in the Arctic with the Inuit for 10 years. And here he is dragging a seal, and he learned to eat the food of the Inuit. And when he went back to New York, he couldn't stand the food, so he imported Inuit food. And he wrote 3 books, and these are my copies, so you have to hunt for them. And title is Not by Bread Alone, but he looked at the role of fat in human evolution. And I believe that what he shows there is that humans have a desire for fat. We have a natural tendency to search out fat, but it's been replaced by sugar. So as you eat more sugar, your desire for fat goes down. And so then, of course, we introduced these dietary guidelines. And we have to remember that this is the diet we've been eating for 2 million years. And this is the diet that, if you're British, only for 2,000 years have cereals and grains been in the British, in North England. And so if you come from Persia, cereals and grains have been around for 12,000 years. But for many of us with white skins from north of Europe, it's only 2,000 years. So what's the fad diet? This has to be the fad diet because that's the most recent diet. And we know that once we introduced the fad diet, everyone got fat. And this is at all ages. And no one will take responsibility for this. Not one government will say, we introduced these guidelines here in 1980, and every age group got fat thereafter. So I stole this slide from Andreas Ehrenfeld, who's one of my heroes. And this is the classic one. Many of you have seen it. Millions of years, and then it takes 28 years. Now, but the point I want to make about this slide is what's wrong? We should all look like that, and hopefully we all do. But this guy's problem, he has got a brain disorder. And you have to understand obesity is a brain disorder. His apostat, his regulator, which controls how much he eats and how much he exercises, is damaged. And in my opinion, that's damaged by the processed foods. But the key is obesity is a disease of the brain. And until we understand that, we won't get anywhere. And the reason why this diet works is because it takes away the hunger and the apostat starts working properly again, and you again regulate your energy expenditure properly. So the theories of obesity are the simple one that we were raised on at medical school, that it's an imbalance problem. You eat too many calories and you don't expend them, and so you put on weight and you go from the brown guy to the yellow guy. And that's garbage, it's nonsense. We all know that, and it's simple. It's wrong because the key defect is in the brain. It's a failure of apostat to regulate energy intake. And it's always energy intake that's the problem, because if the apostat works and I don't run 10 Ks today, all I do is I don't eat that many calories and I stay lean, and my weight will be the same tomorrow as it is today. So reducing your energy intake cannot be the cause of obesity. It absolutely can't be. You have to have the defect in the apostat. In any homeostatically regulated system, you go to the homeostat as the problem. The hormonal model is the one that we propose, and Gary Taubes describes that this is the model that was taught up to 1949 or 46. It was a German-Austrian model, but those two countries lost the Second World War, so all their knowledge disappeared, and we replaced it, because we, the English and the Americans, were much cleverer, we replaced it with our nonsense ideas. And so this was the original model. And the original model is that it's carbohydrate that causes the problem, because, as Grant said, when you take in glucose, you secrete insulin, and insulin becomes the driver of obesity, because insulin causes fat accumulation, and most importantly, prevents you releasing that fat. So whenever you have an insulin elevated, you can't access the fat, and in some way that tells the apostat that you're starving. And carbohydrates, importantly, drive hunger. And if you go into a medical textbook, and I'm not going to go through it at length, but Guyton, which is the most famous textbook, it's all medical schools around the world use it. He describes it in 10 lines. He describes insulin causes obesity. There it is. And we teach our medical students that, but then 4 years later they meet the cardiologists, and then we're in trouble because they get taught something else. This is the model that I use when I talk to people, and I said, if you want to regulate your weight, you need to understand the grams of carbohydrate you eat a day, and Grant showed essentially the same graph. The only difference I've got here is that it depends on your level of insulin resistance. So if you're mildly insulin resistant, eating lots of carbohydrate, exactly as this graph showed, you won't be fat, and eating a low carbohydrate diet will really make no difference, precisely what he showed. But as you become more insulin resistant, your weight will be higher on any level of carbohydrate intake. And the key point here is the flexion point. The flexion point. Now, we don't have the scientific proof this is true, but when you deal with patients, this is what it looks like. So if you're moderately insulin resistant and morbidly obese, you can cut your carbohydrate down to 250 grams, but nothing will change. Absolutely nothing changes. But if you get down to 25 grams, then you're going to score. But a person on this curve, if they get back to 25 grams and they get an ideal body weight, as soon as they start increasing, they just have to increase to 100 grams and they'll be overweight again. And what's 100 grams of carbohydrate? It's absolutely nothing. And that's what we don't tell the patients, or the conventional nutritionists don't tell the patients, that if you are morbidly obese, you have to get down to 25 grams a day. And you have to stay there for life. And that is what Atkins taught in 1972. So I just thought I'd show you some of the people whose lives we've saved. This is a guy 2 years ago, 163 kilograms, 28 weeks later, following the rules, only 2 rules for obesity, only 2 rules, 25 grams a day, no sugar, and then of course real foods, but those are the 3 rules. And 28 weeks later, that's what he looks like. Yeah, he's our champion. We've got more, we've got guys up to 100 kilograms, we're going with them, but they haven't quite reached the 100 kilogram weight loss. And this is his weight loss. And you know, the point is, if you can do that with one person, you can do it with 2 people, you can do it with 4, you can do it with anyone. So the model works. And so we do understand what causes morbid obesity. It's not a complex disease. That's the problem. People say, oh, there's so many causes of obesity. It's not. It's simple if you understand it. And this is what he said. Noakes has become a dear friend, very supportive. He saved my life, and I'm forever in his debt. He receives a lot of criticism. I haven't heard of any failures. For me, a phenomenal journey. And these people are terribly, terribly important. Probably my favorite, is this guy's a medical doctor who's tried everything. He's gone under full medical care. And he's got diabetes, atrial fibrillation, sleep apnea, hypertension, gout, dry, flaky skin. And he's tried everything, and he said, the diets don't work because I'm always hungry. And he's fully medicated. And his HbA1c is 6.8 at this time. And he's with diabetes. He goes on the diet, doesn't lose much, loses about 25 kilograms. And his HbA1c today is 4.8 without any treatment. He's completely cured of all these diseases. So the problem is he's got insulin resistance, as we'll show, and it's the carbohydrates that are killing him. It's not the insulin resistance that kills him. He is still insulin resistant here, but he's not got the disease. Incidentally, he went to his wife here and said, I'm going to be dead in 5 years. You better make alternate arrangements. So, so that's the first point, that you don't need carbohydrates. The second point is what we're taught at our medical school: condition of insulin resistance doesn't exist, or it's uncommon, or it's, in my opinion, it's not important. The reality is that insulin resistance is the single most important medical condition in the global community, by far the most important medical condition. Yet we won't teach it in our medical schools. And just a simple statistic, there are 30 million Americans with type 2 diabetes, there are 80 million with pre-diabetes. That means that without even testing them, we know that 37% of Americans are insulin resistant. And look at this population, that's undiagnosed. And I would guess there's another 30 or 40% out there. And it's predicted that 40% of currently living Americans will develop diabetes by the time they die. 40% of Americans. So what we weren't told in my medical school is that we are treating what we see above the surface and we're ignoring what's below the surface. And above the surface, we see type 2 diabetes, gout, obesity, hypertension, and this atherogenic dyslipidemia. But underneath is the problem, and that's insulin resistance. And we exist on this either from we're highly tolerant or we are intolerant. And I stole this slide from Jeff Volek. And we have to decide, exactly as Grant said, if you're carbohydrate tolerant, you're probably an athlete, and you probably will be normal body weight all your life, and you probably don't have to worry about what you eat, except you must eat real foods, not processed foods. But if, like me, you're diabetic and sitting down this end, then it's different, because you will become heavy with age, you will become obese, you will develop the metabolic syndrome, and you will develop type 2 diabetes. And that's the issues. And we don't teach that. And we don't tell people that this is for life. That's the difference. We teach that you get fat and lazy, and then you get insulin resistant. And I don't believe it's anything. It certainly doesn't apply to me. It's the genetics. You get the genetics. And ultimately, if you continue to eat carbohydrates, you will end up on this side of the equation. And what happens in insulin resistance is very, very clearly defined in the literature, in the body of work. And I'll just go through it very briefly, that I believe it's a genetic predisposition. You're born with it, and it gets worse with age because of all the things that Grant showed you, but particularly sucrose and physical inactivity. And the key abnormality is a liver that overproduces glucose. That's the key abnormality in insulin resistance and diabetes. So my problem is I've got a liver that is forever pouring out glucose. And that glucose, unfortunately, can't be taken up and stored normally because your muscles and liver don't work properly. And as a consequence, you always have an elevated glucose, and so you're always hypersecreting insulin. And that insulin then acts in the liver to turn that carbohydrate into fat, and you get triglyceride production, and it gives you your fatty liver, as also Grant showed. Now, the secondary effect of that is to lower your HDL cholesterol, and in addition, it produces these atherogenic small, dense LDL cholesterol particles. And that brings you this atherogenic dyslipidemia. So if you want to know what is bad to have in your blood, those are the things that you don't want in your blood. And that's the mechanism, and it's so absolutely obvious. And the point is that if you are insulin resistant, every time you eat carbohydrates, this happens. Every single carbohydrate. And I'll show you that by this paper by Dr. Peterson. And it's titled The Role of Skeletal Muscle Insulin Resistance in the Pathogenesis of the Metabolic Syndrome. And all they did was they took a group who are highly insulin sensitive and highly insulin resistant. They were young men, 25, but they were all lean. So as far as they were concerned, they were all healthy. And then what they did was they gave them carbohydrate, 2 carbohydrate meals at 10 o'clock and at 2:30. And they measured their blood glucose response, and it was pretty much the same, even in the insulin resistant who were in red. But look what happened to the insulin secretion. And these are young men of 25 who do not know they are sick. And look at the values, are huge. They doubled. The insulin secretion is twice as much. And their triglycerides are very high. And really worryingly, this is the amount of new fat produced in the liver in consequence to those 2 carbohydrate meals. So this is what happens every time a person with insulin resistance takes carbohydrate. And you do this for 20 years and you get to me. You get what happened to me. Eventually you can't secrete insulin and you get diabetes. So the point is that insulin resistance is a real disease, and we can identify it in young people. And we're not all identical, and those who are carbohydrate or insulin resistant will develop the fatty liver when exposed to a high carbohydrate diet. Now, Grant did show this slide, and this is just some of the best work done by good friend Steve and Jeff Volek. And this is one of their brilliant, brilliant papers. And we could not stand here if it wasn't for Steve's work and for Jeff's work, because they were influenced strongly by Dr. Atkins, but Dr. Atkins didn't have their data. So he couldn't stand up and say, I know I'm right. But because of their work, we can say we know we're right. And that is a huge, huge difference. So thank you, Steve, for that. But in this study, they took a group with metabolic syndrome and gave them either a high carbohydrate or a low carbohydrate diet. And I'm going to go through it very quickly because of time. This is their body mass was reduced more on the high-fat diet. Their abdominal fat was much more reduced. But notice glucose, and glucose was reduced. And look at this insulin. And I'm going to show you how insulin is the real killer. Massive reductions in insulin on the high-fat diet that we won't worry about. And then the triglycerides go shooting down because of the reasons I showed you. If you're not feeding insulin-resistant people with carbohydrates, their triglycerides will come down. And then the HDL cholesterol goes up on this diet and goes down on a normal carbohydrate diet. And this is supposedly the good cholesterol, and look what it's doing. So if you're putting patients on a high carbohydrate diet, you're actually harming them because you're lowering the HDL cholesterol. Many believe that this is the best predictor of your heart attack risk, and look at the ratio dropping. The triglyceride HDL ratio goes shooting down. And these are the bad toxic particles, the small LDL particles. On a high carbohydrate diet, they go up. On a low carbohydrate diet, they go down. And those are some other variables that we won't discuss. Now, which diet would you rather be on, the yellow or the red? It's absolutely clear. And then my conclusion is the following. The initial treatment for an abnormal carbohydrate lipoprotein inflammatory blood profile should be a high-fat diet, not the use of statins, and I'm not going to go into that, but statins are the most ineffective drugs ever produced by humans. They help 1 in 140 people. Just remember that, 1 in 140 people, and that's men. Women, it's even less. So, you see, what Steve and Jeff have shown is that this theory of atherogenic dyslipidemia is completely wrong. This is what we are taught. You eat a high-fat diet, you get all these problems, and then you get arterial clogging, and then all these diseases are separate diseases. That's very important that they're separate diseases. But that's wrong, because that is caused by a high-carbohydrate diet. So the model's wrong. It's much more likely that this is the case, that it's a hypoglycemic, hyperinsulinemic inflammatory dyslipidemia, in which you eat a high carbohydrate diet that produces all these toxic changes that are damaging to your health. You then have a low omega-3 diet, and then you get this condition and all those diseases. But notice, it's one cause and one treatment. That's the key. It's one disease. They're not separate diseases. And how do you treat it? You cut the carbs. And that's logical. And you know what I've said today, I give this lecture repeatedly. Never has a doctor got up and said, Dr. Noakes, you're talking rubbish. They'll say it in the media, but they won't say it when they see the data. And so there we go. So since it's the only intervention that addresses all risk factors, the single most important intervention in the management of coronary heart disease and diabetes is to reduce the amount of carbohydrate in the diet. It seems absolutely logical when we present it that way. Did Tim Noakes make this up? No, Gerald Raven made it up and is a giant in medicine, and he described the insulin resistance. He started in 1960. No one knew what insulin resistance was. 50 years later, he is the father of insulin resistance, and this is the model that he describes here in 2012. This is the model, and I take this figure directly out of this publication, directly out of the publication. He says, if you have insulin resistance, the key is you've got compensatory hyperinsulinemia. He describes that as the problem because it's insulin, not carbohydrate. It's insulin that causes all those changes. And that then you either get heart disease that way or your pancreas fails and you get type 2 diabetes and you get coronary heart disease. But the focus here is this. This is the cause of the problem. It's the hyperinsulinemia. And those are what happens as a consequence. Now, Jerry Raven should get the Nobel Prize, but he may not because he's made one error. Insulin resistance does not cause the disease. I repeat, insulin resistance doesn't cause the disease. There's something missing on this diagram, and that's what's missing. It's the high carbohydrate diet that causes that which causes that. And so therefore, the treatment is to remove that. And then you can live very successfully with this. And I believe that with insulin resistance, you can be incredibly healthy. And I believe it's an evolutionary adaptation, which had some value. It's not a cause of disease. And so what's the balanced diet that we hear of? It must minimize insulin secretion at all times if you have insulin resistance. So the next one I'm going to go very briefly through. The dietary animal saturated fat causes heart disease. Actually, there's no definitive evidence that dietary fat causes any disease at all, no, and heart disease. And so the theory is this, that you eat the fat and you get your clogged arteries, and your arteries clog, and then you have a heart attack and you drop dead, boof. And what I want to make the point that not one of these components has ever been proven. Not one. And I don't have the time to go through it. Not one of the predictions has ever been proven. And so it's astonishing. And I don't have the time, but in other lectures, I'm probably on YouTube, you'll see I go through it. And so I'm just very briefly going to tell you the evidence. Here's the first study showing no significant evidence for concluding dietary saturated fat is associated with increased risk of coronary heart disease. And it was written by Dr. Krauss. And Dr. Krauss is a crucial player in this whole thing, because he was the first to confirm Dr. Raven's finding that it's a high carbohydrate diet that produces atherogenic dyslipidemia. And he showed that on a high carbohydrate diet, you produce small, dense LDL cholesterol particles. So there was him. And then there's a whole bunch more. But the most important book written in the last 20 years is The Big Fat Surprise, written by Nina Teicholz. And she reviews all the evidence, the so-called evidence for the low-fat diet. She goes through every single experiment, and she details the errors in meticulous detail. And she comes to the conclusion, the advice that comes out of this book is that a higher fat diet is almost assuredly healthier than one low in fat and high in carbohydrates. The most rigorous science now supports this statement. And she concludes, in the end, what we believe to be true, or conventional wisdom, is really nothing more than 60 years of misconceived nutritional research. And I apologize to have to tell you that nutritional research is one of the weaker sciences. And it's because most of it is based on associational studies, where we associate one foodstuff with particular disease. And you can't do that. Associational studies prove absolutely nothing. And that's where the error comes in. It's because of use of association. Before 1961, there were our ancestors. And that's what you have to ask your great-great-great-great-grandparents, what did they eat? What did the first Australians eat? They ate lamb, which they brought from Cape Town. They brought the merino lamb from my town to Australia, and that's what they ate. And before them were the ancestors with their hunting bows or traps or livestock. But like lost languages, lost skills, and lost songs, it takes only a few generations to forget, and that's what's happened. Now, if you want some good evidence that this whole hypothesis is complete garbage, here's a paper published just 4 months ago. And what they did was they looked at your coronary artery calcium volume, and that is the most important predictor of your risk of heart attack. So if you have low, you will have low risk of heart disease. If you're up here, you'll have high risk. So then they looked at the relative risk, or they followed this population and said, well, what's your risk of developing heart attack in the future? In the lowest group, we give you a 1, that's the standard. And you'll notice it goes up progressively, so that if you have the most coronary calcium, you are at 5 to 6-fold increased risk, which is a massive increased risk. Now, you would have to predict that this group has cholesterol through the roof, and this group has very low cholesterol. So let's look at what the cholesterols were. These are the cholesterol values. 169 is just below 5, which would be considered normal. The next group, it's lower. The next group, it's lower. The next group, it's lower. So the group with the lowest cholesterol have the worst disease. I wrote to the guy and I said, surely you must do a scatter plot of cholesterol versus calcium volume scores. And he said, no, we're not going to do that, because it would be all over the place. And what it would show is that the calcium in your heart cannot be predicted by your blood cholesterol concentration. And you're all being told that if your value is above 5, you're about to drop dead tomorrow. We have no idea. You could have pristine arteries at a value of 10, and clogged arteries at a value of 2. And no one will tell you that, but that is the truth. So this guy won a Nobel Prize. He said the more LDL there is in the blood, the more rapidly atherosclerosis develops. All cardiologists will tell you that. That is garbage. Please hand your Nobel Prizes back. Now, just to make it compounded, this is a paper 2 years ago of the risk factors for coronary heart disease in 500,000 people. And what's the number one risk factor? Overweight. What's the next? What's the biggest risk factor? Normal blood lipid concentration. So if you have a normal blood lipid concentration, you're at risk of heart attack. But they don't report that. But that's what happened. So 72% of normal cholesterol, hypertension, smoking, diabetes. Now you look at those, where do carbohydrates come in? Please understand, obesity is purely a marker of a high carbohydrate diet in someone who's insulin resistant. That's all it is. So when you see obesity, you just say, high carbohydrate diet, insulin resistance, cause of the problem. Hypertension is part of the metabolic syndrome, part of insulin resistance. Smoking, diabetes is obviously. What's causing the diseases? Carbohydrates. That's the only conclusion I can draw. So I'm not going to go through it in detail, but all those, not one of those has ever been proven. It is completely mythical. So Albert Einstein said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. All the predictions of this model remain completely unproven. And this cardiologist said, although the image of coronary arteries as kitchen pipes clogged with fat is simple, familiar, and vocative, it is wrong. And we've got to get it out of the teaching of our medical schools. The reality is that Fred Kummerow has been studying this problem for 60 years. He's 99 years old. He wrote this book recently. And for 60 years, he's been studying oxysterols, oxidized cholesterol. And that's the problem. It's when the cholesterol becomes oxidized that it is in arterial plaque. And if I was a young scientist, I'd want to understand what really causes coronary arterial plaque, because research stopped because we knew it's cholesterol and so on. Richard Feynman, one of the greatest minds the earth has ever produced, he said the first principle that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been doing. Okay, the final point is cereals and grains are uniquely healthy. This is what we are told. And what the consensus guidelines deny is that gluten and gliadin may be the cause of a wide range of chronic diseases currently considered to be idiopathic. And the man who has, and these are the books, and I know Dr. Perlmutter has come to Australia, will be talking, William Davis as well, and Anthony Colpo. Those are three books that really need to be read. This is really interesting because he looks at all the evidence for controlled trials where they increase the grain consumption and nothing happens. You don't get better. And so William Davis said the gliadin protein of wheat gluten present in all forms of wheat has the unique ability to make your intestine permeable. And I'll show you how that happens. And this is the hero, Dr. Alessio Fasano. I hope he wins a Nobel Prize because he's a giant in the field. And he discovers that gliadin causes the production of zonulin in the gut, and zonulin then produces the leaky gut syndrome. And he believes that all autoimmune diseases are related to gliadin in the diet. And this is a complex slide, but what he says is that when you have gliadin in the gut, the gut cells produce zonulin, and this is the junction between the two cells, and you notice it's tight and it's held together, rigidly held together, so the cells are tight like that. When you eat gliadin, you produce zonulin, which opens up the pathways, and then anything in the gut can get into the bloodstream. So any protein, abnormal protein bacteria can get into the bloodstream, go to the liver, produce an autoimmune response. And his theory is that all these diseases, all those diseases, are linked to leaky gut. And that is astonishing. And he maybe is right, maybe he's wrong. And from my own experiences, autoimmune disease, I think he's right there. Because anyone with autoimmune disease, when they cut wheat, they will generally improve their symptoms dramatically, and some will maybe even reverse. So here's another genius who's taken a whole group of different diseases and said they may all be related. And if I was a young scientist, I'd want to know what is the role of wheat in the leaky gut in the causation of chronic disease. So, has the promotion of 5 to 11 servings of cereals, grains per day led to an increase in autoimmune and other diseases? An important question. Finally, just going to finish up. Ignaz Semmelweis in 1840 showed that if you washed your hands, you could bring the incidence of childbed fever down. That was before anyone knew that there were such things as bacteria. And what was happening in his hospital was that the doctors were doing the autopsies on the mothers who'd recently died in childbirth, and they would go straight from the autopsy room to deliver the mothers. And he worked out, because he was a genius, that that was what was happening. He wrote up his story a bit late, but we now know that 82% of all deaths from childbed fever in his hospital would have been prevented if the obstetricians had followed his advice, just by simply washing their hands. And the question is, why didn't? They didn't because they couldn't conceive that doctors were killing their patients. That was the problem. And I believe the same applies. Does the same apply to our current nutritional guidelines? And the reason we won't accept is called cognitive dissonance, because it's too painful for us to accept that we were doing something wrong that was killing our patients. So we'd rather just forget it, pretend it doesn't exist. Now, finally, I'm very, very irritated with one Australian. And his name is Barry Marshall. Not seriously. He wins the Nobel Prize. He's exactly the same age as me. Why did he win the Nobel Prize and Tim Noakes didn't? And so, because he was also studying marathon runners when he first started. And the story of Barry Marshall is really interesting, and it reflects on your own country and your own medical education in a positive way. So, you know, why did these two Australians win a Nobel Prize when anyone could have? Anyone in the world could have won the Nobel Prize, but they did. Why did they? So what happened was, Barry Marshall was a young doctor. He was just going into his residency in gastroenterology, and he had to do a thesis, a master's thesis, the lowest level. And he said, well, what can I do? And the guy said to him, well, there's this eccentric guy, Robin Warren, who sits in the bottom of the hospital. No one speaks to him. He does his own thing. Why don't you go speak to him? Because he's got this mad theory, completely wrong theory, that bacteria can cause ulcers. And so Barry Marshall goes down and chats to him for 2 hours and realizes this guy's not stupid. He's actually developed a stain that can show that there are bacteria present in ulcers. And so he says, okay, I'm going to work with you. And 20 years later, they win the Nobel Prize. Now, the point of the story is that if this guy had worked in a medical school where they said, you are completely wrong, we know what causes ulcers, you may not continue your research, they would not have won the Nobel Prize. But because that university was open to new ideas, which I must tell you were completely against the teachings. They were just as much against the teaching as they are today. And so they won the Nobel Prize. So it's a credit to the university that they had an open academic policy, and particularly to the professors who were teaching these guys. Eventually, Marshall, to prove that he was right, had to take the bacteria and actually get taken himself. And then he developed the ulcer, and he showed that he developed the ulcer, and he took the medication, and he cured himself. And that was fulfilling the Koch's postulates. And Koch was really interesting because he, in about 1880, said, I believe that the tuberculous bacillus causes tuberculosis. And he went before his community and he said, how can I prove it to you? And they said, Dr. Koch, go away and prove these 4 principles. You have to do X, Y, and Z. And you came back a year later, he said, I proved this, I proved this, I proved this, I proved this. I proved that there was not one question. They said, okay. And in a sense, that's what we need. We need open debate on this thing. Tell us to go and prove. What do we have to prove that we're right? And so my final comment for Barry Marshall is every generation of medical students is taught at least one utterly wrong fable. And he destroyed the one fable. And that's our job as a group, is to destroy this fable, which is much more important than even the work that he did. So thank you for your attention. It's been a great privilege.